This episode is all about how to pass the CTA APS papers with this episode's guest, Nitin Rabheru. You're listening to episode 78 of the Tax Professionals podcast.
Welcome to the Tax Professionals podcast, the podcast dedicated to helping you improve your tax career. Here's your host, Jack Bonehill.
Hi everyone, welcome to this episode. Get ready to learn how to pass the CTA APS papers. I know many students who find this exam difficult, including me back when I sat it. It's because it's not about whether you are correct from a tax perspective, which I was confident with. It's about whether you can provide good tax advice, which I was less confident with back then. The most prolific guest, Nitin, joins us in this episode. It's about the 7th episode he's joined us on now, and for good reason. He's now got over 23 years experience as a tax lecturer, and he knows how to help you and other students to pass the CTA exams. We share how to study for an APS exam, how to revise, and effective strategies that will help you to pass this exam. Nitin also shares his unconventional tip related to the executive summary that you'll need to produce in this paper. We also cover the key reasons why students fail this exam, how to deal with getting the awareness knowledge that you need, particularly for those of you that are on the ATT CTA joint pathway. We cover advice if you're thinking to sit an APS and AT paper at the same time. We cover how the marking works, the criteria to pass. We cover what the pre-scene is and how you should use this. And we also cover the importance of planning and how to plan, along with some final advice from Nitin for passing this exam. Rough timings for each section of this episode can be found in the show notes for this episode at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP78. The only link you need to remember is a link for the show notes for this episode. thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP78, as all other links mentioned in this episode are included in there. If you only take away one thing from this episode, please let it be that this exam is about providing client advice, not demonstrating that you're a tax guru. Clients don't want to pay for that. They want helpful advice that they can understand and do something with. Bear that in mind. So, whilst you need to pass this exam to qualify, it's also helping you to develop a career-long skill that you'll need to be a good tax advisor. The show notes also include a link to all other exam-related podcast episodes for those of you that are interested in those, and also contact details from me and Nitin if you'd like to get in contact with us. For example, if you want to get copies of the example revision summaries or tax flashcards to help you pass the CTA exams. All of these have been created by Nitin himself. If, like me, you're interested in knowing what you're worth in terms of salary, then get in touch with James from the Tax Recruitment Company to benchmark what you're currently on. From his interaction with many different businesses and tax professionals, he has current knowledge of salary rates, based on experience and specialism. Speaking with James could help you to negotiate a pay rise or determine it's time to find a new role. Contact details for James can be found in the show notes for this episode at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP78, or you can book a chat with him by heading on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/salary chat. So get in touch with James to benchmark your salary or to discuss potentially available roles, particularly if you work in corporation tax, as he's currently recruiting for many roles in this area. Without further ado, let's get to the episode. So this is like, maybe 6th or 7th one of these podcasts we're doing together now on ATT and CTA stuff. Who would have thought it like 3 years ago that we'd have got this far?
Mate, it's been an absolutely amazing journey. And also huge congratulations to you on your recent award, Rising Star Award from Tollies. That needs to be mentioned on this podcast.
Thank you.
Honestly, the amount of work, effort you've put in just helping students and providing a platform, where you've brought so many people within the professions to kind of share their expertise, their knowledge, and also your kind of tax masterclasses on legislation. It's do you know what, it's really proud to be part of. And when I did my first ever podcast with you back during COVID, we never would have guessed what journey or what path it was going to take us on. So no, it's fantastic.
Yeah, thank you. And to be fair, I didn't realise how instrumental having you on the podcast would be either, because I think probably 50% of listeners have come because of you.
Oh, bless you. No, it's great. It's good. And and also this journey that we're on, we've met some amazing people along the way. James Howell, Autumn Murphy, plus so many others that have really helped out and got involved. And long may it continue.
Yeah. Let's do it, and hopefully we will continue with all of this in this episode today, because we've not actually covered APS specifically before, have we? Our tips, generally speaking, have been a bit more generic than that.
Yeah, absolutely. We did that Zoom session but that came from past students, but we actually haven't done one, and I think this will beautifully complement everything else that's out there.
Yeah, is it called APS nowadays? Application skills, is that right?
Application planning skills paper, yes.
Oh, application planning skills paper. Okay. And this one, I think, is like completely different to every other paper that people do up until this point. If they've done ATT, and all the other CTA exams, like this one is different because all the other things are really about like being right in terms of tax right. And when you come over to APS, this is more like, it doesn't really matter now if you're right or wrong. You still do need to be right, but it's more about, is a client going to find this valuable? Are they going to be able to do something useful with it?
Absolutely, totally. And I think that is the main stumbling block for many students, that transition from the advanced technical papers into APS, which is what we're going to talk about.
Yeah. What's the biggest problem that you kind of see then, like all the reasons that students find this difficult compared to like the advanced technical, for example?
I think there will be, what I found over my 23 years of teaching, that you'll always find 10% of students will naturally gravitate towards APS. They are natural born writers. They know how to advise. So for them, this podcast doesn't really matter. But for the majority, what a lot of students will do, and anyone listening to this podcast will hopefully agree, that when they do an advanced technical paper, they have this comfort blanket. There's no negative marking. So if they get something technically wrong, the marker will ignore it and they'll credit what's right. Yeah, it doesn't matter the format or the context in which you write. You can use, short sentences. So you can kind of knowledge dump in advanced technical to a certain extent, but you need application, and you're still going to score marks. The problem you have with APS, the biggest problem you have with APS, is that you literally have to learn to write again and give advice. So, for example, if a student is doing, say, OMB advanced technical or individuals advanced technical, and there is a shareholder selling shares and business asset disposal relief applies, a student can simply write short sentences by saying Mr. A or Miss A is selling shares, and the kind of things you'd want to mention in your answer is there is a material disposal that triggers a potential for BADAR to apply. And then the student will then list out the conditions. The student will then talk about the 10%, the £1 million allowance. Okay, so you can be quite prescriptive in an advanced technical paper. Now, if that same student were to use that answer in an APS answer, that student would fail, because the examiner doesn't want a prescriptive approach. What the examiner wants is for us to actually give advice. So what I teach my students to do is, in an APS exam, you want to have a model answer ready that you can adapt. So the model answer for this would be that we would write to the client and say, first of all, that you will qualify for BADAR because you have held a minimum 5%. Your company is clearly a trading company. You've held the shares for the last 2 years whilst being employed in the company. And that's it. That's it. And you then literally explain that you then have a recommendation section in the APS, which is really important, where you then in the recommendation section talk about the tax impact, that we recommend you make a claim for BADAR when filing your 22-23 tax return. This will save you CGT of X amount.
Mm-hmm.
So that is what students are struggling with.
Yeah.
It's that difference. Okay. And you can apply that to, if you're doing the IHT APS paper, where you've got a PET or a CLT, or you've got BPR, where you're being prescriptive on an advanced technical paper, to here where you've got to actually give advice. And that transition is what most students struggle with. That there's nothing new to learn, Jack.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, it's a new skill that they're not embracing.
It's mindset, really, right? And just using that example that you've given there,
Yeah.
Like, let's translate it to the real world, for example, where you're actually advising a client. They don't care if there's a material disposal or not. They don't even know what those words mean. Like,
Not relevant.
don't mention it to them because it's not going to mean anything to them. But what they
Exactly.
do need to know is the answer. Like, what's the headline? What do they need to know? And then in terms of the other things you mentioned about saying why they can claim bad art in that case, that is almost you mitigating your risks as an advisor, because you're stating what you believe the facts to be to them. And then
Yeah.
the client could come back and go, well, actually, that's not correct. And therefore you can reconsider it. It's just how you would operate in the real world. You'd give them the answer, and then you'd essentially protect yourself, right?
Jack, absolutely. And like talking about you mentioned a really good point, the headline facts. So in a report, you need to do an exec summary. Okay. And I had a student earlier in the year that I had to, in a loving way, paternally tell that student off. So the question related to a share sale, yeah, or a trade and asset sale. And in the exec summary, the first thing that the student wrote was, oh, we recommend that you file the tax return by the 31st of Jan 2024. Okay. And I went ballistic. I said, the client's just paid you 15 grand for a report. Is that the first thing that the client wants to know? If you were a client, is that what you want to know? And the student goes, actually, no, Nick, you're right. What does the client want to know? Actually, what they need to do to save tax? I go, there you go. And that's the bit. Students don't think about the client. Yeah. And that's where the APS paper is different. The APS paper is about being client centric. Okay. Whereas the advanced technical paper is about your display of how much you know technically.
Mm-hmm.
And the minute students accept that difference, they will pass APS.
Yeah. I actually quite like this idea is literally just new to me, but in a way, when you're giving something to a client, you want to grab their attention straight away. It's a bit like marketing. You want them to pay attention and you want them to carry on reading. In the example that you just gave, if you said to them, file a self-assessment by the deadline, they're going to go, are you really telling me that? Is there even like any other benefit? Even if there's some really good points, like a few beneath, they're going to be like switched off straight away, right? You got to, especially in today's world, like people's attention spans are small. Like, don't lose it on the first bullet point by putting something that's not that interesting or important.
Do you know the main thing, and what I tell my students to do in an exec summary, is the first bullet point should really be about why did the client commission that report? Because in the question, the examiner will ask you that the client has certain concerns, yeah, or they're seeking certain advice. You have to deal with those first.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I always say to my students, always start with what is the tax liability before any reliefs are claimed. Does that make sense? So you want to shock the client into, oh my God, I've got X amount to pay. But then your second bullet point should be about, okay, but however, we recommend you claim BADR and you will save CGT of X amount.
Yeah.
You know, and so that's when the client, that's when that is value added. That's where the client's thinking, wow, I've paid 15 grand for this report, but I'm saving 80.
Yeah. I think it's with clients anyway, like whenever they're coming to you for advice and they want something specific, so you need to like address that straight away. There's always extra things that they haven't thought about or that they're not aware of, and then you have to obviously explain those things to them too, right? But as you say, address why they've come to you first and then move on to the other stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
I know I'm very much talking about this, by the way, as if it's real world, but obviously this applies to the APS, right? Because you've almost got to imagine a client on the other end receiving this report that you write in the exam, right, or advice letter, whatever it is that you end up producing.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the massive, you know, I've had students put section numbers in the APS report. No. Yeah, do not use section numbers. You know, do not use terminology unless it's briefly explained. You know, it's really important that your answers for APS need to be very simple. Yeah, it's very simple, tailored, and you will pass.
Yeah, the way I used to think about it, to be fair, was because most clients, unless they're like an FD that's been very involved in tax or something like that, most clients are going to have very little, if not no, prior tax knowledge prior to coming to you. My benchmark used to be, do I think my dad would understand this if I was to explain it to him? And if the answer is no, it's not good enough, it's too complicated, it needs changing.
Yeah, totally.
And that's not me saying, by the way, that my dad's stupid, because it's not, but it's
No,
just the
no,
fact,
no.
you know what I mean? Like, it,
Jack, do you know what's interesting? Like my wife, as you know, formed her own company just before COVID, and with her all the legal work that she does. And it's actually for the first time in my life, I've got someone in my own family that I treat like a client who actually struggles with basic things that we take for granted.
mhm.
Why can I only take out X amount? Why can't I do this? And it's interesting. What we take for granted as tax advisors, clients actually struggle with, and that's the beauty of the APS paper.
Yeah, this is really hard to do, but if you can almost place yourself back just before you started working in tax and think about the knowledge and what you would have understood then,
Yeah,
that will help.
yeah, totally.
You mentioned as well, actually, some students find it difficult because there's almost like no steer with this. Like in advanced technical, you get 5 marks for X, you get 10 marks, and the students get told that, like,
Mm.
alongside the question. And with the APS, you don't get that. I mean, you don't even get like marks now anyway, do you? It's like the
No,
grading in the different areas, etc.
yeah,
But how
yeah.
do you think students should get past that so that they don't go off like a random tangent or waste time or whatever?
So the way that I teach is on the taught phase, the 3-day taught phase that I do at BPP. Days 1 and 2, Jack, I've written my own past paper questions. Yeah. And I give students 10 minutes to read the question. And what we then teach them is how to dissect each point that the examiner's given. Yeah. Okay. So, for example, in OMB APS, if the company is VAT registered, then if there is then a trade and asset sale, we would say to the students, look, this is where you then have to talk about transfer of a going concern. So we kind of show students how to connect the dots. Yeah. So how to spot the clues or the scenarios within the question. The minute and so when the students see that registered in other questions, they're like, great, we remember this, we know what to do. And so over the 2 days, Jack, that's what we do. We work through scenario after scenario.
Hmm.
What I then do on day 3 of the taught course is I actually go through the previous past paper for 7 hours. Yeah, so we work through it line by line, using planning, and we actually have a whole answer. So students then have this major confidence boost on how to then get through that exam. So it's really showing them the skills. There's very little technical knowledge that I teach, Jack, because they've already acquired that from the advanced technical paper. Yeah, it's all about not panicking, showing them that, look, keep it simple, read it line by line, read the question line by line. Don't make any hard and fast judgments immediately, and just kind of grab the key points. And once they get comfortable with that, it's quite a difficult skill. It takes some students a few sittings to get there. But once they get there, that they actually say, Nick, this exam is really easy. That once you get past the content, it's doable.
Yeah, just on one point there, because you mentioned about like students gathering like all the knowledge along the way, so you don't really have to teach any material. I remember
Yeah,
specifically that because I was on the ATT CTA joint pathway, that I didn't have to do the awareness paper, and I know a lot of other students are in that position too. So actually,
yeah,
when I came to APS, like my awareness knowledge was next to non-existent, and I remember being quite worried about that
yeah,
because it was like, do I need to learn this in how much detail? And I think Tolly's, who I did it with, only provided memory jogger
yeah,
level
yeah.
knowledge. How do students cope with that then? How do they make sure that they have enough awareness knowledge for this paper?
It's a really good question, Jack. I get a lot of students panicking about awareness, and I understand. So what I tend to do is on my courses, I will always cover the VAT and the IHT. Yeah. And over the 23 years that I've been teaching this paper, the examiner will only test certain things. I'm not making a prediction here, but from our experience, because it is awareness level, okay, what I say to my students is don't waste time worrying about awareness. We will also, once we get the pre-seen, I would also bring in other awareness topics that I think might be relevant. So with the recent May 2023 exam, Jack, it involved the OMB APS paper. It involved someone owning a construction company. Okay. So I also covered the construction industry scheme for my students. I said, look, if it didn't come up in the real exam, but we covered a lot of the VAT to do with construction as well. Again, it didn't come up. So we would always make sure that based on the information given, we will also cover relevant scenarios.
Yeah, got it. It's hard though, isn't it, for a student, particularly for someone like me that likes to know everything and the detail, to just not worry about the awareness.
I get that, but my concern is I've seen students fail this exam because they've spent so much time learning every single awareness topic, okay, and lost sight of the main paper knowledge that they needed. They've got to trust the tutor here. The awareness level, it's very key basic points.
Yeah.
Seriously.
I suppose anyway, like people should definitely focus on technique first. I think that's probably the hardest bit of this exam, right?
Agreed.
Technique.
Agreed.
If you get to the end, close to the exam, and you've clearly mastered the technique and you're not worried about that, and you are a bit worried about awareness, I suppose there's no harm in them doing a little bit of stuff at that point, but focus on technique first, worry about awareness second.
Yeah, totally. I think that's crucial.
Just a reminder to benchmark your salary, find out what you're worth, or to discuss available tax roles, get in contact with James at the Tax Recruitment Company. His contact details can be found in the show notes for this episode at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP78 or by heading on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/salary chat. So I know you've got a firm view on this about sitting the advanced technical and APS at the same time. Like you suggest to students that they do them in different sittings. I actually set them both in the same sitting, which like, why is it that you say do it in separate sittings and avoid doing it in the same one?
Do you know what it is? It comes down to the student, yeah? And like I said before, there are some students who are natural born writers. And I had a student who sat both at the same time, passed both. And this student, for GDPR reasons, I can't show you the email, but this student wrote that I would never do this again. It actually ruined my life doing both at the same time. And I think what it is, it comes down to your reasons for doing both. My concern is a lot of students are told it's the same content. You don't need to learn anything new. You might as well do both at the same time. Okay. My worry is that most students struggle already with doing an advanced technical paper. They can't cope. Yeah, they find it too demanding. And they're then told that it's the same content. Yes, it is the same content, but it's a different way of writing the answer. And that's why you get so many people failing, because they're writing in an AT style approach. And that's the feedback I get from retakers. Yeah, that I can now see why I failed the APS paper. And so it's really important that if you write reports for a living, yeah, and you're comfortable doing exec summaries and you can cope with doing both, then you have my blessings to do both. Yeah, 100%. I would support you. I would say the majority of students don't have that comfort factor, and that's my issue.
Yeah. Because I think you said earlier when we were speaking as well, like most students won't have consolidated their technical knowledge at the point they will go on the APS courses.
I've had this. So on day one of my talk phase on APS, I do this amazing example involving a trade and asset sale. Yeah, and I literally go into a lot of detail involving intangible fixed assets and goodwill. And I literally had a student write who was doing AT at the same time. Nick, what is an IFA? Yeah. And at that point, I said to the student, you shouldn't be doing both papers at the same time. Yeah, the student didn't like that comment. The student actually went on and failed the APS paper. Okay, didn't take the advice because the problem was they'd only just finished the talk phase for AT. They hadn't had a chance to consolidate. They were behind on their technical knowledge. So for them, that there were huge knowledge gaps. And so the learning experience that we wanted them to enjoy and benefit from, this student wasn't getting that benefit. It wasn't helping them. And so, there's no point coming on a course if you feel demotivated, and with APS, we can't teach you the basics. Yeah, because that's all assumed knowledge. My job is to show you how to write and apply. Yeah. Okay. So I had one student saying to me, Jack, oh, I don't understand the associated disposal rules. Well, go back and learn it. Yeah. Yeah. Because at this level, you need to know that. Yeah. We'll always deal with the complex stuff, Jack. Yeah. But core basics, the student's got to take the responsibility. They've got to come technically prepared.
You know, I know no question's meant to be a stupid question, but sometimes I do get questions. I think like, do you really not know the answer to that or how to solve it? Like the one you just said there, I don't understand this rule. What answer is there other than go and learn it? Do you know what I mean?
No, I'm a little bit. What I tend to do, what I would do when I get a situation like that, I draw a quick diagram and I type and I actually go back to go what is. And I'll always say to that anyone listening to this podcast or I've taught before will know, I will always go back to the student and say, tell me what you don't understand. What is it that you do not get? Does that make sense? And so, and at that point, you'll get two types of students. You'll get one type of student that doesn't even know what the rule is. They've never looked at it. For that type of student, I will not help them. Yeah, because they're lazy. Yeah, they haven't learned it. That's not my problem. Whereas the student I will help is where the student will say, but Nick, I'm confused as to when that would happen. So we just draw a little picture, Jack. And I'll say, look, you've got a shareholder, and the key thing is the asset is owned personally. Then you can help them, because if it's an understanding point where they've tried to learn it and they've struggled, of course I'm going to help them. But my point is I want to filter out, are you the lazy student? Okay, or are you the one that's actually trying to understand it? And of course I'll help you.
Yeah, and they're struggling, yeah.
Absolutely. And the minute you start drawing pictures and the nicest bit is when the student will say, I now get it. My job is done.
Yeah, that's a good point, to be fair. I was almost putting everyone into that first category where they've not even learned it.
Yeah.
So just before we move on to like how to prepare and stuff, which you have touched upon a bit already, like I think it's worthwhile just very quickly talking about the grading for this, because it's not confusing, but I always forget because it wasn't how it was when I did it. But there's like 3 or maybe 4 areas now that are graded between 1 and 4, is it?
Yeah.
So what are those areas? How does that all work?
So basically the APS marking grid is split into 3 areas. You have structure. Okay, so the structure is a straight pass or fail. Okay, so that's really going to come within identifying. So the structure will literally be the format. Okay, so in the exam, please make sure that you know how to use a letter format and a report format. Okay, that's there because there are slightly different nuances in those. Make sure your whole answer flows, it's an appropriate style. The CIOT have released some revised guidance last year on what they want us to do in the appropriate style. Okay, so there's some clear guidance for reports and letters. That's very important. And also having the right grammar and spelling. So you've got structure. From my experience, the majority of the students do not struggle with structure. Okay, no problems whatsoever. Where it kind of gets a little bit demanding for some students is the other 2 categories, that being identification and application. Okay, and then the advice and recommendation. So if I just briefly touch on advice, identification and application, what you've got to do here is it's really important that you identify the issues. And so we spend a lot of time on the talk phase helping students with that. Okay, and I do that by walking them through questions. I give them 15 to 20 of my own past paper questions to really help them practice spotting issues. Then also using that information to do some basic calculations, showing them how to ignore irrelevant content, okay, and really start thinking about the advice for the client. Then the final category is going to be the advice and recommendation section. So this is the bit that most students struggle with, is when they start writing, because many students start writing in an advanced technical approach. They're not going to score the mark. They're not going to get that 3, okay, because they're too technical. Even though they may be technically correct, it's too technical, okay? They're not actually advising clients, and I go ballistic if a student hasn't given me a recommendation section. Yeah, if there's no recommendation section, Jack, when I'm reviewing their scripts, I won't mark it. I actually refuse to mark it. Yeah, because I said, look, you're not going to get the mark. So you need to, so when you're actually writing the answer, give the advice, but keep the recommendation separate. And we will show you how to do that.
Yeah.
Okay. And also what the examiner also wants, this is the really sexy bit, Jack. They actually want commercial advice. And at this point, students fall apart thinking, oh my God, I've got to be a business advisor. No, you don't. You know, if something, just imagine that you're advising, like Jack, you mentioned earlier about advising your dad. Yeah. You know, you've got to think, if you're, imagine that the client is a close family friend or family member, we might say, look, you shouldn't do this because commercially it may not make sense. So the kind of things the examiner likes to hear are things like short-term, long-term, cash flow. Yeah, so tax advice is great. Tax advice is great, but it may not always be commercial. Yeah. So for example, you know, if a sole trader has trading losses, okay, and they're going to be saving income tax at a higher rate in the future, great. Yeah, we know that from a tax perspective, that's the right advice. But commercially, you might want to tell the client, however, from a cash flow perspective, if you made a current year claim, it could give you a cash boost right now, albeit slightly less than what's in the future. Does that make sense?
Yeah, of course it does. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
And
considering more than just the tax, right?
Yeah, mate, absolutely. And the minute you start bringing in just a little bit of that practical commercial advice, your answer goes to a different level. And that's what the examiner's after. It doesn't need to be something super like Dragon's Den pitch level. Okay. It's just sensible advice.
Yeah. And I think where there's advice that might not be commercial, but it's like optimum from a tax perspective, I think you might disagree with this, but I think there's no harm in mentioning it and just like noting the fact that this is probably unachievable in the real world. And this is probably the most realistic scenario that you can go down, and then advise on that.
Yeah, absolutely, mate. Absolutely. And that's what students need to be mindful of.
Yeah. Okay, so we have touched upon this a bit already anyway then, so I don't think we're going to need to spend too much time talking about it, but in terms of like how to prepare, how to study for this exam, sounds like there's nothing to do in terms of technical knowledge, maybe apart from refresh if they sat in a previous sitting and they might have forgotten.
Yeah.
But other than that, mainly by the sounds of it, it's focusing on the technique, how to write a response to this exam so that they can get the marks in each of the three areas that we've talked about.
Totally.
What's the best way for people to do that, and how should they prepare?
What I would want students to do is, first of all, make sure that your advanced technical knowledge is up to date. You don't need to be technically perfect, okay, because the APS exam will not test you on obscure areas, but just make sure you're technically comfortable, yeah, with all areas of the syllabus, be it for whatever paper you're sitting. That's the first thing, okay? What I then want students to do is, during the talk phase, you need to read and plan as many questions as possible. Yeah, you need to read and plan. So you're comfortable spotting issues when gift relief might apply, VAT transfer of a going concern rules might apply, you know, when stamp duty, land tax might be relevant. If you're doing the taxation of large corporates, yeah, when transfer pricing might be relevant. So you need to be comfortable in when to discuss the right things. But the final bit, Jack, and those of you, I strongly recommend you also listen to the Zoom, watch the Zoom session, is you need to start preparing model answers. So model answers so if we take OMB APS as an example, Jack, I will get my students to prepare various model answers, like generic answer plans for BADAR, for a sole trader, for a shareholder. And so if that came up in the real exam, they've already got an applied answer ready. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Obviously now that it's closed book though, right? So is that almost just knowing that to remember it in a way? Is that right?
They do. So yeah, absolutely. So with the closed book, in fact, my students have said it becomes easier, because if you're thinking, do I need to learn the whole model answer? Well, no. what you can do within your model answer, just think about the key words that you would want to mention in your advice. Yeah. So you're not learning a complete sentence, but you know what advice is going to go there, and also what you're going to mention in the recommendation. Yeah. And so and I actually show that on my taught and revision phase. I show people how to revise. Okay. And so and actually there's less to learn for APS than there is for advanced technical. Seriously.
Well, yeah, because you've already done the hard bit.
Exactly, Jack, exactly. So I think a lot of students unnecessarily get stressed, yeah, or have a panic over the APS thinking, oh, there's so much volume. There isn't. You've done the hard stuff. Okay, this is a lovely paper. Enjoy it.
Yeah, I must admit though, actually, I was even worried about this one. When I sat it as well, it was the last sit-in where it was the old marking structure. And the new marking structure that I knew was coming in scared me at the time. I was like, I just need to pass this now because I don't want to do it under this new structure. It seems more difficult.
Yeah, but no, it's not. It's a very fair paper, but the problem is that students don't switch. What the biggest problem is, Jack, is the student doesn't give the examiner what they're looking for. You will get so many students who are listening to this podcast right now who literally expected to write in the same style as advanced technical. That is the only reason why they're failing.
Yeah.
They're not adapting. They're not advising the client.
This point, by the way, about giving what the examiner wants, like I think this is a really useful skill to learn anyway as a tax advisor, because when you're advising clients, you need to give your clients what they want, not what you want to give them. So even though getting used to creating something that you know someone else wants is going to help you massively at work.
Yeah, totally.
Do you want to talk a bit about the application of, I'm presuming this is knowledge, and applying it to the actual question itself? Because I think students get a bit carried away with this, or have we already covered it?
No, yeah. So, okay. So we kind of covered it a little bit earlier with the Badar example, but I want to talk about this. Okay. So from a student perspective, okay, what I do on my taught phase, Jack, is we will work through various scenarios. I will then ask my students to send me in a report. Okay, so during the taught phase, I take in 2 reports and I review them, non-technical. I literally rip them to shreds. Okay. And what we try and do is to show the student, yes, you have the technical knowledge. Okay, if I were to give you a blank sheet of paper and were to ask you to list down all the points relevant for company car benefits or living accommodation or, company trading losses, I have no doubt that most students would be able to list out all the points. For APS, that approach doesn't work. Yeah. What the student needs to do is have that knowledge in their heads. Okay, these are all the issues, but what they've got to do is then put in a paragraph how that is relevant to the client. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So students have to think about what's relevant. What does the client need to know? So the main thing is tax impact. This main thing is tax impact. So I'll give you a quick example. So if we were looking at an advanced technical paper and we were talking about company cars, yeah, we would always start with list price times the percentage based on emissions. Yeah, and there's all the other factors around it. I won't go into it here. In an APS paper, think about the client. The first thing that I would start with is I'll talk about the taxable benefit, that this is employment income taxed on you. Yeah, can you see that it's the same stuff? But then I would then briefly talk about what it's based on. Yeah. And I'll then also bring in the fact that there'll be no NIC liability for the employee. It's just for the employer. Since we're advising you, it's not relevant. So, and that's what it's that practical advice. It's the same stuff as AT, but you've got to prioritize. One of the key skills for APS is judgment. Yeah. The examiner talks about judgment. And what we mean by judgment is don't knowledge dump. Don't tell me everything about company cars. That's what most students are doing, Jack. And that's why they're not hitting the 3 or the 4s. Yeah. Okay. Just give the client enough. The client then doesn't really care about if it's a diesel supplement or,
Yeah.
It's like, we need to hold back. And I think some students get a little bit tax giddy in the exam, that they want to share all their tax knowledge. Hold back. Yeah. Client will switch off. Like you said, they have short attention spans. Let's just focus on what they need. Done.
Yeah, I know we like to think that clients will be super excited when we talk about tax, but I've probably come across one in like 8 years of working in tax. Like, to them, it's just a necessity. They just need to deal with it. So, give them what they need and nothing more.
Do you know, my wife, so we were at a dinner party about a month ago, right? And we met some of my wife's friends, and they asked me, what do I do? And my wife started laughing. Yeah. And said, oh, he's in tax. And at that point, like, my wife said, oh, everyone's going to switch off now, because she knows how I get carried away. Yeah, I do. And she goes, Nick, and she gives me this pre-party warning that, Nick, I know you love tax. I know you love talking about, your summaries and everything, but not everyone shares the same passion. No, and this happens, but we do. Like, we love tax, right? We can talk about it till the cows come home. And yeah, and I think that's the problem in the APS paper. A lot of students kind of share that bit too much love in the paper, and then they run out of time. Yeah, and then they don't. And I've had this with my own students. Oh, Nick, I talked about this too much, but why?
Yeah. Just very briefly then, anyway, revision then, because to me on this paper, like the preparation phase and the revision phase are almost like the same, at least very similar, right? Like, is there any difference to you between like the studying phase, like practicing the questions, how to plan, do stuff, etc., compared to revision?
So the main distinction for me on my courses is, on the taught phase, we spend most of our time showing students how to plan. Yeah, so I will handhold them through that process. On revision, Jack, I give my students an hour and 20 minutes to plan, review the pre-scene and plan. So there's no support. What I then do is I debrief the paper with them. We go through it. So what we focus more on revision is the application. Did you spot this? Did you make the link? Yeah, so that's where revision is different. Okay, and that's where students begin to benefit. Yeah, that's when things for the well-prepped student start falling into place. Yeah, totally.
Okay, so just to make sure I'm following then, almost the revision phase is almost taking the plan, turn it into things that you'll actually then write in the exam itself. Yeah,
exactly. It's taking it to the next level. Okay. Because on revision, we're now, because I would have expected them to have looked at all my past papers that I've sent them and everything else, they should be in a much more comfortable position on format.
Yeah.
Knowing how to spot issues, knowing how to deal with numbers. Okay, they're in a much more commanding position. Absolutely.
Yeah, so it's almost, in a way, I suppose study and revision phase are probably not the best words for this in a way. It's almost like just breaking down, learning how to write the answer or how to get to their final answer. Because the first step is know how to plan. And then it sounds like the second step is now learn how to apply that plan and write a good answer.
Perfect. Yeah, beautifully summed up, Jack. Yeah, totally.
So then right before the exam, is it 2 weeks before? I'm not sure the amount of time you can tell.
Yeah, about a couple of weeks before, the CIOT for all the APS papers will issue a pre-scene. And so that pre-scene, okay, and this is really important, Jack. I get students messaging me who I haven't taught saying, what do you think's coming up? And please don't, because it irritates the living daylights out of me, because they're the students that make me nervous. The pre-scene is simply there to help you become comfortable with core client information. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, for example, in the May 2023 OMB APS pre-scene, okay, we were given an individual that owned all the shares in an unquoted trading company that she had inherited from her father. Okay. Now, she was, I think, aged in the mid-40s. Okay. And so from looking at that information, Jack, what I said to my students here, and she wasn't married, she didn't have any children or other family members. Okay. So we weren't predicting what's coming up. But what I get my students to do is imagine that this is a client who's turning up to your meeting the following week. What kind of things would you want to prepare for? Yeah, well, the first thing what we're not going to be preparing for is family planning. Yeah, in tax terms. Yeah, she's not married. She has no siblings. Okay, she has no children. So that's not something we're going to be concerned with. Whereas in previous papers, that was relevant. We were given a family with children, okay, where the IHT planning and the CGT gift relief was relevant. Okay. Also, she was in her mid 40s. So it was, and the company, you know, it was ticking over nicely, but it wasn't making millions. So therefore, I kind of said, I'll be very shocked if this was about exit and retirement. Yeah, because it seems like I think this is someone who's still got quite a few years of earning capacity left in her, that she's probably going to look at new ventures, okay, or she's going to look at growth or expansion. Okay, so you know, getting the students, getting their mindset in the right place. And also this question involved a construction company. Okay, so we covered areas like construction industry scheme, which didn't come up, but it was an awareness level topic. And I reassured my students, look, I'm not predicting it's coming up, but just in case, we did that. We also looked at all the VAT on construction as well for residential and commercial properties. We covered all of that. So what we tend to do on the pre-scene, Jack, is try and boost the students' confidence with, look, if this was a client in practice, these are some of the relevant issues that the examiner could ask. Yeah, but we are not definitively saying this is coming up. And I'm happy to say that ever since this APS paper has been introduced, I've pretty much been on the money on some of the issues that have come up.
Yeah.
You know,
You've somewhat answered my follow-on question anyway, which is
so,
I'm sure you get students that are like, why do we need to do anything really before the pre-scene? Because when the pre-scene come, we can figure out everything that might be an issue, and then we can make sure we know those rules and ignore the rest of the syllabus. Like, how would you respond to a student like that?
Yeah, dangerous. I mean, I had one person who is a tutor from another training body, and we kind of look at the pre-scene together. Yeah. And he said to me, 100%, he goes, construction industry schemes coming up. Literally. Yeah. And he told all his students, construction industry scheme is coming up. I would never do that. I would say, look, it could come up, but it may not. But you need to be ready for it. And I think that's the difference. I think don't put all your eggs in one basket and think this is it, because the examiner can throw a curveball.
Of course,
clients, like clients can. Yeah, we don't know what's happening in that client's private life until they turn up at the meeting.
Yeah.
You just don't know. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
It's impossible to predict the future anyway. I don't agree with that other tutor's approach. I'm sure you don't either in that respect. But it's like, it's guessing, isn't it?
It's guessing. And do you know what? I would never do that to a student. And talking about this 40-year-old, you know, I had a friend of mine who was in their 40s, similar scenario to this client, Jack, in the APS exam in May, terminally ill. So it was succession planning. Yeah, terminally ill, and that's real life. And so so the examiner can throw the curveball. You know, where I've said it's very unlikely, but it could be anything. But if you're a well-prepped student on OMB APS with TOLIS, CAPLAN, or BPP, you're going to be fine.
The pre-scene in a way is just making it a little bit easier. Well, if you plan well at the pre-scene stage, you're almost just making it a bit easier for yourself when you get to the proper exam. It's not all the prep, is it? But it's going to take a bit of the pressure off, because I'm sure you then would have prepared in some areas that are very likely to come up. So you would definitely have that really fresh at the front of your mind, right?
Oh, Jack, 100%. And an example of that was in the May APS OMB paper, the pre-scene, we were told that the company was VAT registered, and so all their supplies were taxable supplies. And so in the actual question, it was a trade and asset sale. Yeah. So the VAT TOGC came up. It was relevant, and my students were happy. Those that emailed me, Nick, VAT TOGC came up. Yay. You know, they can spot it. But on day one of they would not have spotted it. They go, Nick, I can't believe I've got the things started coming together. So yeah, it kind of worked out really well.
Shall we just very quickly touch upon the plan? Like, how important is the plan, and like how much detail should people put into that?
The planning is the most difficult part for me as a tutor to get across to students. Okay. And it's about how much do you put on the plan. So what I recommend students do is they create squares. Yeah, so they have 3 or 4 sheets of paper with 4 squares on each paper, so grids. Okay. And this is a technique, Jack, that I've been using for years at BPP on ICAW kind of advanced tax papers. So it's a technique that it's proven that it works. And so what we want students to do is it's like when you're in a client meeting. Okay, if a client comes into if a new client comes in, Jack, right, and you're asking them, and they own a company, okay, and they're going to say to you, oh, my company was formed here, whatever. From a tax perspective, you want to capture the key information. Is it a trading company? Yeah. So does Badar qualify? So you're going to ask them, how much do they own? How long do they work? And so you want to capture that core information that's relevant for advice. And so that takes a bit of practice. So the main problem here, Jack, is that you've got to learn to create a different square for different things that are coming up in the question. Okay, so one square could be about company information. I get other students to create another square about, if they give you financial information, oh, this person takes out a salary of 70,000, we know straight away they're higher rate taxpayer, they still have a personal allowance. Okay, oh, the company itself owns land and buildings, it's not opted to tax. Okay, so there's a double taxation issue there. And so you've got to learn to grab the core information. And one of the things I find a lot of students doing, and they get better over time, is they overplan. They end up copying the question into the plan. Whereas what I want students to do is look at what's in the question and bring in the tax impact on that. Yeah, bring in the tax impact. That's the key thing. And that is what we work on very methodically on the taught and revision phase.
Just to make sure I'm following there then. So are you saying the whole plan is done in this grid, essentially?
Yeah, so what happens, so how it works in the real exam, okay, so I say to my students, the exam is 3.5 hours. You have 1 hour in which to read the question, go through it line by line. You only read the question once, and you capture the core information on your plan into little squares. Okay. And you also do any simple calculations that you need to help you with tax impact. Don't overcalculate for APS, please don't. Then within that 1 hour, you then need to think about, what has the client asked for? Yeah, and what I get them to do, Jack, this is the killer point. With their plan, I get them to think about the exec summary first. What are the 5 key points you want to tell the client? Because if you can't do that in the first 45 minutes, you can't pass that exam. Yeah, because from that information, you are able to work out, this is what we're going to do. This is how it's going to work. Yeah. So once you've done the exec summary, that's given you a beautiful structure of how your main report will now follow. Yeah, you can then carve it out into different sections.
Okay, so that was one of my next questions, to be fair. So you're saying the structure comes from your exec summary? Because I was thinking, where does the structure come from with this grid thing?
This is why, Jack, this is why people are lost. Yeah. And I used to be one of those tutors that used to tell students, do your exec summary at the end, because that's what we do in practice. Yeah, we always do the exec summary at the end. But I realized 3-4 years ago that this wasn't working. And so I trialed it, and it was a massive game changer. And the number of students that have given me recommendations on LinkedIn or personal emails that have said, Nit, that approach of doing the exec summary first was a game changer. Yeah, because it basically gave you that consolidation. Yeah, and the 5 key points you're winning on. That's where you need to be.
Yeah, got it. So is there anything else in terms of advice that you think students should be aware of to make sure that they pass this paper?
So in summary, for me, is number 1, if you're going to do both papers at the same time, then like Jack, you need to consolidate your AT knowledge early. Yeah, before you go onto that APS course, yeah, you need to make sure you know your AT content. Okay, if you feel like that's too much, then do one paper at a time. Okay, but it is possible to pass both. It is possible to pass both. Okay, I find a lot of students from my experience struggle. Okay, but you've got to do what's best for you. Number 2, remember that with the APS, it's about model answers. Yeah, keywords, key advice. Okay, make sure you have a recommendation section. And number 3, it's about planning and reviewing as many past paper questions as possible. Okay, and the minute you can start spotting issues and bring in tax impact, you will pass this exam. And my final point is make sure that you read the candidate scripts, okay, that are on the CIOT website. The candidate scripts are a fantastic way of showing you how the examiner wants you to apply your knowledge. And so I found students found that really useful. Yeah, you don't need to read the question. You don't need to worry about what the question is. Just read the candidate scripts. Just look at the format, look at the layout, and it will be a massive game changer for you as well.
Well, I'm sure it'll help people see that it's not about technical knowledge, right, as well, which is the big point you started off with about mindset and how to approach it.
Yeah, absolutely, Jack.
The show notes for this episode include all the links mentioned throughout this episode, including downloads to free resources to help you to pass the CTA exams, other episodes to help you with the ATT and CTA exams, and also mine and Nitin's email addresses so that you can get in touch. If you'd like samples of the example tax flashcards, tax squares or summaries, for example, for the CTA exams, then send us an email, but feel free to get in touch more generally too. The show notes also include a link to some free webinars related to passing the CTA exams, some of which include me, but all of which I believe include Nitin. If you enjoyed this episode, why not subscribe? Head on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/subscribe, where you can sign up for email notifications. Episodes are bi-weekly and are released on Mondays. But that's it for this episode. Hope you found the episode useful and have taken away some useful points to help you to progress, develop, and improve your tax career. Until next time.